Good evening, everyone. I would like to welcome everyone to the second annual Fairfield Board of Finance Capital Planning Summit. This is our long-term capital planning summit. We instituted this last year, working with members of the RTM, members of the Board of Education, and the Board of Selectmen to discuss the long-term capital needs and capital planning for the town. Tonight, we thought it appropriate to host this meeting in the newly completed, hurricane-tested, and Irene-approved Penfield Pavilion. And I think that it would be just if we asked that Mr. Jim Gallagher and Mr. Rich White, who were intimately involved in the building of this structure for all of Fairfield, to lead this body in the Pledge of Allegiance this evening. So if everyone would please stand. Mr. Gallagher and Mr. White, please come forward.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
So I think,
Mr. Chair,
Mr. Tetra.
if I might, just on behalf of the Board of Selectmen, certainly happy to be here to join in the session. I did want to mention that my understanding is Ms. Stenick is on her way, is kept a little late. Mr. Walsh called me earlier today, mentioned that he had, Ms. Stenick is here. Mr. Walsh called me earlier today and mentioned that he had a prior engagement and would attempt to be here at the end of that.
Thank you, Mr. Tetra. I appreciate that. I would also like to, if there's any members of the Penfield Building Committee here, I'd like to recognize you and thank you for all your hard work and effort on making this this structure possible through the course of several years worth of effort. So thank you very much for that. Before we get started, Mr. Gallagher, do you have anything you'd like to say to the collected body?
Just thank you very much for the support of the Board of Selectmen, Board of Finance, and the RTM. It's a great project. We're very proud of it. I cannot give enough credit to Mr. White and the whole first crew and Jerry for the design and the input. It was a terrific project to work on. There was a tremendous amount of cooperation from all the parties involved. We're very proud of it. So hopefully we'll do it in about 100 years.
Thank you, Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Lombardo, thank you as well for all the effort that you and your team put in on Penfield, and good luck with it. And I know your rental revenues will be up. All right. Tonight is a special meeting. The special meeting of the Board of Finance to review and discuss the capital plan and debt service bonding requirements and projected debt service funding, including related waterfall models for the next several years for the town and the Board of Education. This goes to our bonding commitments year after year and our interests and debt paydown commitments over the next several years. Before we get started, we'd like to welcome from the Board of Education Chairman Mottola, as well as Dr. Tidal, who are joining us tonight. We'd also like to recognize from the RTM Representatives Baston and Schwartz, who are here to represent that body in these discussions, as well as Mr. Tetra and Ms. Stenick for the Board of Selectmen, and Mr. Tetra already spoke with Mr. Walsh earlier this evening. With that, we'll kick that over to Mr. Hiller and Mr. Tetra to lead us off tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We're really looking at this as a workshop. We're excited about getting everybody's input and looking at the discussion tonight. We've put together a number of charts to kind of step through and really focus on some of the assumptions we can make going forward and some of the impact we have. With that as an intro, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Hiller to kick things off and step us through.
Thank you, Mike. We have presented here tonight, there's several documents, and for the members of the public and the press who are here, there's I hope, an adequate number of the same documents over on the table and back of me towards the entrance. And I'd like to walk you through where we are. Obviously, I think if there are particular questions that come up, the chair could recognize people
at that time. We'd be happy to attempt to answer any questions that people might have specific to the material that's in front of them. Hopefully, the documents that were placed in front of the members at the head tables are in the order that we're going to discuss them. The first one is the capital plan, which was presented some 55 weeks ago this evening at the first annual one by the former first selectman. And I think we can move pretty quickly through it. You've all seen it in the past. It does bring out a couple of the projects, particularly on the town side, that we will be discussing as the evening goes along, specifically the upgrade to the Fairfield Woods Library and the upgrade also to the clubhouse at the Smith Richardson Golf Course. Obviously, the first item on the list is the Penfield Pavilion, which we sit in, and that has been completed. Additionally to that, there was a projection over that four-year period, and I emphasize four-year period, that there be $19 million on a gross amount committed to the Board of Education for the major projects. Additionally, three-quarters of the way down the page, there was the indication that there would be on what we're going to refer to again as non-recurring capital of a $2 million annual commitment to the Board of Education and $1 million to the town for what I would term smaller projects. If you turn the page on this, it just brings it out a little bit further and also gives some idea as to the order of magnitude of the debt schedules that are before you. By the end of the evening, you will see that these numbers change, certainly not dramatically, but the bottom line numbers as far as what our debt service is running out, and we've given projections which actually, in the future case, will run all the way out to fiscal 23, see some numbers that are modestly higher than these levels. I don't know if anyone has any particular questions on this document, because, as I say, this is history that we're looking at here, and it's nothing that is before us for the future. Second document that I'd like to point out is the policy on bonding and capital purchasing, which the Board of Finance adopted this past spring. It very specifically discusses what can and cannot be bonded, the bonding period as far as the number of years that would be involved, and what we would be avoiding. Again, I think the document is one that's very familiar, particularly to the Board of Finance. It has been distributed to the various departments and other critical boards who might contemplate major capital projects in the future. The next item that is before you is what the various bodies have passed as far as authorizations since this meeting was last held. As you are aware, we can go down this list. Penfield Pavilion, the Sherman School project. One thing on Sherman School should be the realization that the $800,000 appropriation that has been passed by the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Finance was heard last night in committee at the RTM level, and be heard tomorrow night at the RTM level, and be acted on by the RTM this coming Monday night, the 26th. That adds $800,000 to what is already approved, bringing that to the listed figure of $3,050,000. Additionally, as we are aware, obviously, we anticipate bonding needs in the $5 million neighborhood for the Fairfield Metro Center, which was passed by the RTM earlier this month.
Mr. Hiller, why is it 5 million and not the 7.5?
As you're aware, there has been a commitment by the Department of Transportation, the state of Connecticut, to fund up to $3 million, not less than two, up to $3 million. It is our current estimates that we will not need to exceed $5 million as far as this appropriation is concerned. And a similar thing could be noted with Penfield. We haven't received yet, but we have commitments from the state of Connecticut for a $200,000 steep grant. The authorization is in fact $200,000 more, just as the authorization for the Metro Center is in excess of what we did. These are figures that we anticipate, net of those two grants, that we will need to finance next summer.
And Mr. Chair, if I might add, that's consistent with how we handle school bonding projects, and that we typically include the net amount, net of the 20% reimbursement that we anticipate to go with that. So we thought that was the best way to reflect the most likely bonding amount.
So for all these projects, we can assume they were handled the same way? The bonding portions of the project are the net portions of any grants, et cetera?
Yeah, for this group, Sherman might be the one to consider. Sherman specifically didn't go for any state reimbursement, so that's the gross and net number for that are the same. So that Mr. Hiller pointed out the two projects that were net numbers on this list.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Hiller.
So this gives some order of magnitude as what has really transpired before the the finance and legislative bodies of this town in the last, essentially the last 13 months. And pretty much gives everything that's immediately on the table. We anticipate we will be going to market next summer in July of 2012 with a bond issue. We put before you here a prospective bond sale which has funds that have either been committed or, in the case of the two high schools, projects that are in the, what I will call, immediate short-term pipeline. Things that realistically might see some approvals prior to June 1st. We really have a fly out of here. Our deadline really in order to get approvals and to size the issue for bonding would really be the May meeting of the RTM. And we would anticipate, obviously, if there is approvals, if there are approvals on the two projects, which the board, the Board of Selectmen and the RTM have given at least monies for study, and that is the window project at Fairfield Ludlow High School and the roof project at Fairfield Ward High School, that they would be ready for some discussion during the winter months. I've spoken with Mr. Kelly. He is in the study on the windows, which we had previously appropriated $35,000 for that study, has been completed. They've gone out now to a professional estimator to put a price tag on it. I think the roof project is running slightly behind that, but not significantly behind it. So I think during the winter months, certainly prior to the budget deliberations, there's some likelihood that there may be funding requests on those two projects.
There might be others as well that were put to the TFC and to other bodies. I think we have the overall roof project for the schools comes to mind. It's about $900,000 or so, correct?
And the McKinley roof.
And the McKinley roof, the repairs there.
Mr. Cullen presented, I think, to the Board of Education, I believe the board has it, I didn't distribute it, but Mr. Cullen presented a document last week that shows the schedule for various projects and where they are in what I'll call in the pipeline.
Do we have copies of those for the board?
I don't have copies of that available. I have a single copy, but
Was
I
distributed
can list the ones. One, which will be discussed, has been tabled until the
We distribute.
the October meeting of the Board of Finance, is the roof repair project, which was first heard at the July meeting, late July meeting of the Board of Finance, and has been tabled.
Before, Mr. Hiller, before you go any further, Dr. Tittle, is Mr. Hiller referring to the documents that you forwarded electronically, that I then distributed to
Are you referring to the document labeled pending facilities projects?
Yes.
And it lists the roof repairs, the Ludlow window replacement, the Ward roof replacement, the Sherman Core upgrades, the McKinley roof repair, the Riverfield, and the Tomlinson facade work. That's the document. I have a dozen copies of it, if you want to pass that around. That shows the history of these projects and where they're sort of in play.
If you have hard copies, it'd be great to pass that around.
Yeah, I wasn't
don't wanna
sure.
No, I appreciate it. I don't want to refer to documents that people don't have before them.
I
So,
also have a summary document, the two-page version of that shows each project that was requested by the Board of Ed, what the final approval was of the supposedly $2 million.
could you pass those around as well, so we make sure? These were distributed electronically. I want to make sure we have a hard copy. So, Mr. Hiller, what you're currently doing is, you're walking us through what was done since September 2010 till today, and then you're saying, hey, in the next few months, we have these items that are going to require some type of action, presumably before the May RTM meeting, when you might, which is the drop dead date, to go out for any bonding in summer of 2012, correct?
That is correct, and as I say, in a sense, there's a number in excess of $4 million that's in a, what I'll call it, that is a placeholder for projects that would be in that category. That would not, as an example, includes some of the smaller projects that are on the list that I think Dr. Tittle is passing out, which we would contemplate that would probably be into the short-term, non-recurring categories that
It's the same as the other ones.
we've allocated $2 million for.
Does anybody have any questions on the documents before so far? Mr. DeWitt, I saw your hand. It's the same as before, it's just an extra copy.
Well, as beautiful a building as this is, the acoustics are absolutely more like, barely make out what you're saying, so if I'm asking the question you've already asked about. $1.9 million of paving. I thought we hadn't bonded paving for the last 2 years. We did one last bonding, and then we gave Mr. White $1 million every year after that in perpetuity, frankly, to pave. So is that right, that we bonded 1.9 million?
We have the bond resolution that was passed, and it was passed a year ago in the springtime, was actually for $5.8 million for bonding. $2.9 million, which was passed.
You're going to have to use the microphone.
Sorry?
We can't hear you.
There was a $5.8 million issue, bond issue, which was split essentially into 3 pieces, and there were some caveats that go with it, some restrictions that go with it. $2.9 million was bonded in July of 2010. The restriction was that another $1.9 million would be available for paving if the operating budget were increased by $1 million. That money became available this past April 15th. Likewise, another $1 million, and the final phase of that $5.8 million is available on April 15th of 2012.
Of course, it was the transition to get away from bonding paving into boosting it into...
So after the next bond appropriation, we are done
That's right.
bonding?
But
We're on a 3-year cycle, right? That's right.
the limitation on it is that next year's operating budget, in order to obtain or to trigger that $1 million on April 15th, The operating budget has got to increase by $1 million on paving. So we're really just switching.
It's a transition.
It goes into, to operating budget. Well, it's in
Going
this
to
budget.
operating.
It's in our current budget.
Yeah, and it's got to go up again
It's
next.
got to go up again. It's got to go up again by $1 million in order to make the $1 million on April 15th is the operative date,
Yeah.
that money becomes available. The budget isn't recommended or isn't passed by the Board of Finance at that level, deals off.
And, Mr. Chair, if I might, Mr. DeWitt, your memory is absolutely correct. Those additional restrictions and how that was parceled out over 3 years was done at the RTM after it was passed by the Board of Finance.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions, comments, or concerns on the documents before us? And I hold this open to anybody at the table, RTM members, Board of Education members, Board of Selectmen members, anybody. All right, seeing none, go ahead, Mr. Hiller. Or actually, Dr. Tidal, since we passed out those two documents after Mr. Hiller passed out the bonded projects through September 2010, could you briefly walk us through what your administration has prepared and reviewed with the Board of Education last week?
Sure. The document that in the upper right-hand corner says Enclosure 2, which is a back and front document, is a summary of each of the, not sure what the right term for it is, non-recurring projects were.
Just, again, just for the record, we're probably going to try and use that non-recurring term more often now rather than trying to make a distinction between capital improvement and capital project. It just seemed a little bit better term for discussion purposes.
So this lays out, in Mr. Hiller's prior document, you saw that the first selectman had allocated an estimated $2 million for Board of Ed non-recurring projects. So the superintendent recommended projects are listed with the estimated amounts, and then the Board of Ed approval of those projects is listed in the next column. And then the final approval is listed in the final column. The technology switch project, we all remember well, was added in later, so that just sits across at the bottom. So when you net out the $450 for the switch project, of the $2 million, the Board of Ed to this moment has been allocated about $400,000. That's what this shows. The detail shows each of the projects that is still somewhere in the process. Some that were completely rejected are not listed here. So, for example, the Dwight boilers were rejected at the RTM level, so they're not on the pending project list because they're kaput. Well, the boilers aren't kaput. The project to replace them is kaput. So that's what the rest of these are. There is a major roof repair project that came a bit after, and that's listed. That's coming up. That's sitting on the agenda, I believe, for the upcoming Board of Finance meeting. And then you can see each of the remaining projects, some of which are, older. These were projects in the works for several years, is my understanding, where they stand, what the whole process has been for them, where it went, how long it took, where it currently sits, what the time frame has been. So just laid it out and sort of as best we could reconstruct the process and where it currently is. So if you say to yourself, whatever happened to that Ludlow window project? Didn't we approve some money for that thing? Well, you can find it in here, where it is and what the status is. And the only one that also, I included the Tomlinson Middle School one because at the time we were putting this together, it was still pending, but it's also been rejected, and that's on there at the end. So that's really what those documents are.
Thank you, Dr. Tuttle. Does anybody have a question on these documents? One part of the discussion that I'd like to go to, I'm sorry, Mr. Bateson.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I just want to clarify what I'm looking at with this multi-page document, pending facilities. Does that tie into what you're saying, the non-recurring of $2 million a year?
Yes.
All right.
It does, except for the extended roof. The roof repair projects were not in the original Board of Ed request. That came later.
When you plan on financing these, though, do you plan on going through that $2 million non-recurring?
Oh, yes.
Okay. Mr. Chairman,
We
just to
haven't
note...
used it yet, so it's, in my view, sort of still available if there's such a thing. So we would be able to, we would still have money left under the $2 million to do the roof extension projects because the other projects were not approved.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions, comments on the document? Thank you, Dr. Tittle. As I noted in a note to the Board of Finance earlier this week, these documents were shared with the Board of Education last week. It brings up a discussion point for later this evening that we won't come to a decision on tonight, but I think we need to take up the topic, which is the process by which we go about approving capital projects. Because as you can tell by going through the document that was very well done in terms of where these projects stand, they're taking an inordinate amount of time to work themselves through the process. There is a concern that projects are getting backed up, that the status of projects is being lost, and that that could cause issues down the line. So we need at least a brief discussion tonight on the process as opposed to just the finances. And we have some thoughts on how we might want to go forward with that. Okay? So any other questions or comments on those documents? Seeing none, I think we'll go back to Mr. Hiller and Mr. Tetra.
There were two other documents which were distributed to the members of the board, and those, not all the RTM, but one is the Board of Education Fairfield Public Schools Facilities Plan 2011-2015, which was approved by the board in May this past spring, May of 11. I'll refer back to a document within that in just a minute. Additionally, there's a large document that Richard White, Director of Public Works, put together, which is spelling out for this period of time, the 5-year plan, what the Department of Public Works projects are, potential major projects that they have to look at by building, by year, and by an estimated amount. Mr. White does have with him this evening some additional copies, marginally updated beyond it, but I think this becomes a framework, these two documents become a framework for when we get into the waterfall as to where we are. Included, and I would add this, that the facilities plan document is available on the Board of Education's website. If anyone needs copies of it, it's roughly a 40-page document. I will refer primarily in the next handout to the board to page 17 within that document.
Which document?
In the Fairfield Public Schools facility plan, and I did give you copies, individual single-page copies of page 17, which is called the Fairfield Public Schools Long Range Facilities Plan 2011-2015 Summary.
Document. Okay.
Again, this is a document included within the larger facilities plan, but it really spreads out the perceived needs of the Board of Education by school and within a particular time frame. If you look at it, you know, the bottom line number is $33,764,000 net of state aid. Just behind that, what was left to the board, we've basically taken the liberty, because some of these projects have not moved forward, some have, of updating this spreadsheet and adding 1 year to it. As we are all well aware, because of other issues, some of these projects, Dr. Tittle just mentioned that the Tomlinson School project has been defeated. The Dwight boilers were not approved in the budget cycle last year. And more importantly, or the largest item that's in there on the, what I'll call the town's revision to this, is the $3 million, which was estimated for the Ludlow window project, which is ready to move forward in the immediate future. If you look at what we've done on the long-range facilities plan, first off, we've added a year. If you compare these documents side by side, we have taken this out to fiscal 16. It does in fiscal 12 address several of the items that have been approved by the bodies, specifically the first 5 items on that list: the Holland Hill tanks, the Jennings bathrooms, the roof study at McKinley, the roof replacement at Ludlow Middle, and the playground facility at the Early Childhood Center. We put, and this is what I referred to as a placeholder in here, $3 million for the Ludlow windows and $1,576,000 for the first year on the Ward roof. We've also used a figure on all of these major projects of 20% state reimbursement. So the net figure that is taken out of there, the $915,000, is 20% of this figure. This number, if you look at the $4,056,000, relates back to the $4,055,000, which was in the previous one of the previous schedules, as far as the prospective bond sale for July of 12. As we move forward, we've really kind of bumped a few of these projects out. I would add this in defense of the Board of Education. There has been no particular dialogue with the Board of Education. However, looking at it realistically, though there has been a request to the First Selectman and eventually the Board of Selectmen for the appointment of a building committee for Riverfield School, that has not taken place yet. The ability for a project of that magnitude to move forward for next summer is frankly at best remote. And so we've bumped the Riverfield project out to fiscal 14. Likewise, the major project contemplated at Holland Hill School has been bumped out 1 year to fiscal 16. The only projects that we've calculated just for discussion purposes for state aid would be the projects at the 2 high schools, the Riverfield project, and the Holland Hill project. There is the potential on some of these that there might be some state aid available on some of the others, but I think just for discussion purposes, and so you know what you're looking at, this is the way we have calculated this. This takes the total out. It raises the total from the Board of Ed's document by the $3 million, which was really in their fiscal 11 plan, which was the Ludlow project, which, other than the initial funding of $35,000 for the study, has not come forward. This then becomes a major framework when we get into the waterfall models.
So, Mr. Hiller, to be clear, what you did is the long-range facilities plan that the Fairfield Public Schools put together was approved quite some time ago, back in May.
4 months ago.
4 months ago. So what you've done is you've updated that, the town administration
Yes.
has updated that plan based on best available information in your own.
I think what we've done is we've taken everything that they put forward here.
Okay, so where would I find, to that question, just to test that hypothesis, where would I find the $900,000 for the roof repairs across 7 different roofs, or whatever it
Repairs
was?
are essentially, the roof repair project, which will be heard at the Board of Finance in 2 weeks from this evening, is basically in the, and I return to Dr. Title, but
Yeah.
they're within those items
It's in by school.
the elementary school.
Right.
Okay, so it's these items that are in 2012, 2013?
Right.
Those are all the routes? So...
Some of
goes-
them are, yes.
Goes to my next question. I just want to make sure we're on the same page here. Has this document previously been shared with the Education Administration? Okay.
I think the one thing that you will see, though, is that if you take the estimated total in the board's document of 4 months ago of $42,429,000, we have used that number and added $3 million to it. And that $3 million is is essentially the Ludlow
Okay,
window project.
but the title of this document, quite frankly, is misleading because the title of the standalone document is labeled Fairfield Public Schools Long-Range Facilities Plan, 2011-2016 Summary. That's not what this is.
It's not because it's not a product of the schools. And I
This is the town's interpretation of...
town's interpretation, because frankly, the ability to get, we would be missing, for example, the window project. The window project was not contemplated in that. When I spoke to Mr. Cullen, he said that was in fiscal 11. Fiscal 11 has closed. And so what we did is we brought that in, we added that into this list.
Right, no, I understand, I just, like, we're labeling something, or you're labeling something with the Fairfield Public Schools label, and it's not their work product, and they haven't approved it, so I just don't want any bad information getting out.
Point well taken.
Yeah. Mr. Kiley, you had a comment?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think you just answered part of my question, but I'm looking and trying to reconcile these two documents, and I see the difference mathematically is the $3 million. So the town updated document is $3 million greater, but it goes over 5 years versus 4 years. Is that,
I'm sorry, Mr. Kelly, again?
right? I mean, the document prepared by the school administration is a 4-year plan,
Essentially, yes.
and the town
we
document's a
said at
5-year
that
plan.
point, we can't, a lot of these, the time window, for example, if you go back to the Board of Education's document, it contemplates $9,092,000 for Riverfield School in fiscal 12.
Oh, net, yeah. Okay.
Our ability to get that project at that level and the need to borrow for that project at that level is really behind us, we feel, with the exception of some of the roof repairs. If you look the way we split it, on Riverfield, there's $160,169 on what I'll call the town document, which is the roof piece at Riverfield. The big project at Riverfield is estimated by the Board of Education at $8,931,000. So we split that. Now that, and we're saying is realistically, if this moves forward, and if you look back to the document that Dr. Title passed out earlier, it's in the earliest of stages without even a building committee appointed yet. And we're, other than potentially the roof repairs and work on that, the ability to get something done by, say, next September on this project, other than perhaps the hiring of an architect to start the project, is remote.
I'm good.
Mr. Mayor?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What I would describe in front of me is a lot of data, but not very much information until it somehow gets all pulled together. But I have a question, and I refer to your very excellent letter where you said, let's be productive and efficient. And I'm kind of thinking that I don't want to go through, I don't think we want to go through all of these projects.
Nope.
Neither they're worth wildness, if that's a word, their worthiness, thank you, their worthiness or their cost, because each of those, to do that with each of these projects would be a very long, would be a very long time required unto itself. Plus, as we know from experience, Sherman Schools being the most recent, that things just change over time. I do think that as the Board of Finance, our responsibility is primarily managing the final budget. It's managing what we think is appropriate for tax rate changes. And I was wondering if it kind of might make some sense to discuss total debt and how much we think is a reasonable amount to add in a given year based upon tax implications rather than project-specific implications. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I completely concur with your comments. I think what we do have to make sure is that we take into the consideration on a global level what the school system has approved. And my concern more with the document was the fact of how it was labeled. And if the town needs to interpret it and put it into a new format, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page with the data points.
Yeah, I totally agree. I've been trying to figure out what matches what, and I've just not been able to do that.
Yeah, me neither. So I agree. I'm going to go to Mr. DeWitt and then Mr. Belita. Say their hands up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm also a little confused. You know, if we haven't learned anything in the last couple of months about moving money from year to year, right, it always gets more expensive. So we're keeping, let's just take Riverfield for a second here. We're extracting a roofing project, which is detailed on Dr. Title's document here, and just taking that right out of the same number off that $9 million. When we all know that I'm sure in that $9 million, we were going to rip a roof off and do a bunch of work, and when they go to redo the school, they're going to rip the roof off again, and, you know. So it seems strange to me how we can get down to literally to the dollar, but yet we don't adjust for $9 million moving from fiscal 12-13 to fiscal 13-14. There's no adjustment. We keep seeing every time something moves out, costs us more money. So I think it's really inaccurate to just subtract these roofing projects that are detailed here in a lot of detail just out of the top of a big number that never changes at the end of a, much to Mr. Mayor's a 4-year versus a 5-year plan.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Mr. Belita.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to make sure that, again, on these documents, I'm correct here. The one that's labeled Fairfield Public Schools 2011 through 2016 summary, that's a town-generated document, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Now, the one that's labeled 2011 through 2015 summary, where did that come from?
That came from the, that's page 17 in the facilities
Okay.
plan.
So I just want to make sure that's a BOE document. Now, Mr. Hiller, when the town, I should say, made the adjustments it made to the long-range facilities plan by bumping it out a year and moving some things around, did I hear correctly that the Board of Ed was not consulted during that process?
That is correct.
May I ask why?
I think what we were attempting to do is to determine what our, in part, and obviously the final arbiters on that is this board and the RTM, is our level to retain certain debt levels. And debt, when I say debt levels, debt expenditure levels within our operating budget, and how we could do that over an extended period of time. Realizing, as I just said also, that the ability to do certain projects all at the same time was in a sense behind us. That we had to stagger these into the schedule, and that it for our purposes, as far as debt management, worked.
No, I understand the rationale behind it. I'm not questioning that, but what I'm questioning is why you weren't in a room with Dr. Title discussing all this. That, it just seems like there always seems to be this firewall that exists. The fact that we have a BOE long-range facilities plan and the town's version of the BOE's long-range facilities plan, I just don't understand why we can't get on the same page literally and figuratively.
I don't think there's a firewall. I don't think that's a fair characterization, really, and I think that there's ongoing dialogue, certainly between Dr. Title, Mr. Cullen, and the Board of Ed staff, and myself, the first selectman, and other people. I think what we were attempting to do is to set some targets here. It's not cast in stone. We took their document and frankly accepted everything that's there. And a little bit to Mr. DeWitt's point, as far as, and there is some inflation built into their numbers as far as those numbers are concerned. We didn't build any additional inflation in here. But we took their numbers and really just added in total just 1 year, realizing that first off, our tolerance to issue more debt than, say, the 39 million or maybe fractionally more than that in the coming summer is about it, I think, very frankly. And you know, and what we've done before over my tenure here is be able to layer this debt in as we go along, realizing that there are other obligations of this town
Sure.
beyond the capital needs, and we all know what they are, that are going to have impact, to Mr. Mayor's point, on the overall tax rate.
Again, I understand the rationale, but I guess what I'm looking to see going forward is the dialogue between, and you referenced it, but yet with this document, it wasn't present, in terms of a dialogue between the Board of Ed and the town of Fairfield, where we can get the projects, whether it's town or BOE, literally on the same page, rather than doing it almost like two separate but parallel universes, you know what I'm saying? It just seems like the fact that there's a difference between the way you're looking at it and the way Dr. Title's looking at it, and there seems to be sometimes communication, sometimes not. I don't think it's helpful to the process. There's got to be a better way to do that.
I see your point. I guess the other point is, we've given them everything they asked for here. All we've done is added 12 months to a schedule, and we've brought back in one of the major projects that they had. I think, you know, that given the tenor of dialogue that's happened on other things here, if Dr. Title could walk out of here this evening and say, we could get everything, and the Board of Education that was in this facilities plan that we asked for, given, for example, I just pointed out a couple of projects which didn't pass this past year. The boilers at Dwight, the Tomlinson work, just off the top of my head. We've given them that. And so my argument would be to you is no, we haven't had dialogue or haven't had opportunity for dialogue with Dr. Title, Mr. Cullen, and all on this. There's been very minimal dialogue on it to explain it, but we've given them everything they've asked for.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to go to Mr. Tetro, who had his hand up, then I'll go to Mr. Kiley.
Yeah, I think part of our effort here, and these have been ongoing discussions with Dr. Title and myself, as well as Chairman Flynn, in terms of we got to change the process. Mr. Bolito, the points you're making historically are absolutely on the money. The process hasn't worked. So I think the issue is, how do we change it? How do we stop doing things the same old way? And I think as we get through this, what you'll see is we went to an approach, and I'm recommending one, that changes that. I think that as long as you're going to sit here and try and figure out whether Riverfield is 9 million or not, or whether we put let's take Sherman School. That was in last year's capital plan at $1.6 million. Now, we could move it forward and add 5% to it, as Mr. DeWitt suggested. We still don't get to 5 million, which is what it really cost, the 2.2 million that was approved the first time, or the 3 million that's going through now. So the real issue is, how much do we want to spend on debt service? That's what's going to impact the budget, that's what's going to impact our tax rate. And then how do we work within that framework? What guidelines do we put down to do that? And frankly, how do we give the Board of Ed, as well as the town, as much flexibility to work within their changing priorities, and also realize, as costs change, that we need to make adjustments and perhaps move things out. So I think this, in essence, was a planning document from this standpoint, and I think as we get through this, you'll see that what we're trying to do is give the Board of Ed the flexibility they need to make changing priorities within parameters that are set down by the Board of Finance and by the Board of Selectmen that kind of, for lack of a better term, set the box that we play in.
Mr. Kiley?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I understand everything I've heard, I think, but I have two questions on the spreadsheet that was prepared by the town. Number one, is the theory of the spreadsheet from the perspective of this is the year the project would be done and approved, or is the theory of the spreadsheet this is the year that the money would begin to hit the debt service schedule? It's a simple question.
And the quick answer to that is kind of both.
Is what?
The quick answer to that is both, I think. I think really what we've done is you'll see later, and as we've done on, for example, no better example than that than Fairfield Woods School or Stratfield School. Both projects are going to be in two different debt issuances. And so I think we would, look at it as to, when we're going to need cash for cash flow purposes on this, and particularly on the bigger projects. On the smaller projects, that many would be concluded within the $2 million. But, when we get to the waterfall, you will see what we're going to be adding or layering into the debt schedule.
Okay.
Mr. Tetra?
Similar,
Let him, he had a follow-up to answer your...
Just to also help with that, I think what we're trying to do is set up a model that allows for what our experience has been. I think we all sat here years ago and looked at Fairfield Woods as a $9 million project. Then it was a $15 million project, and we approved 24, 25, and change. And so the question becomes, how do you allow for that growth in it, realizing that when you're sitting here putting together an estimate years in advance, without a clear project definition, without an ed spec, without an architect, and without knowing any of the parameters, that those numbers have historically been way off. So what we're trying to do is come up with a framework that allows us to get to a budget and allocation for in total what we want to spend, and as that gives everybody an incentive to manage the project to as low a cost as we can so we can get more things done sooner. But if we don't, we understand the trade-off is we're pushing off more projects rather than just trying to do everything at once. And I think as we get through the rest of this, hopefully you'll see where that kind of comes into play.
thank you. I don't want to belabor this, but I do want to follow up. To Dr. Title, when your spreadsheet was put together, was the methodology for the spreadsheet, same question, from when I look at any year, look at any project, was your methodology, that's the year we want to get that project done?
That's the year of approval.
The year of approval.
Right, so some projects are done within just the following, years. So, for example, those smaller projects that are listed under 1112, we brought those through during the budget process last year.
Right.
The Early Childhood Center is an example, right? We brought it through as an 1112 project, brought it through in the winter of 11, and that project will be completed during the 11-12 year. Something like a Riverfield, we know that's going to get spread out over a number of years, and
That's right.
it's not our purview to say when that bonding and what kind of bonding and so forth. So for us, it's year of approval, and then depending on the project may take 1 year or 2 years or 3 years to do.
Right. Thank you for that answer. And my last question is back to the theory of the spreadsheet from the town side. When the adjustments were made, whether they were made based on we're going to do it and pay for it in year one, or the adjustment was made based on the fact that we're going to bond the money in latter years, similar to what Dr. Title just described, is it gets approved in year one, paid for in year two, finished in year three, et cetera. What was the theory for prioritizing the documents, or what was the theory used for pushing certain projects out? Was it priority? Was it simply to adhere to a debt schedule estimate, or was it something else?
I think the primary thing that we were trying to keep in mind was to keep some degree of, keep a level degree here. One of the things that I arbitrarily took the liberty of saying is we're just completing, for example, the work at Fairfield, not completing, we've probably got another 6 months to go, but the work at Fairfield Woods Middle School. That was brought forward because of the increased population at the middle school level. That increased population at the middle school level is beginning, or is going to beginning to hit the high schools. And what I said, we've got to get some of the work, and if you look at where I put the work as far as the Fairfield Ludlow High School work, that was more front-ended on this, as opposed to the work at Holland Hill School. And so what we were trying to do is to level this out over this 5-year period.
Understood, so that would lead me to believe that it was based on an expectation of debt service, not a prioritization of what projects are important or more important than other projects.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions, comments on this schedule? Let's go to Mr. Bates, and then I'll go to Mr. DeWitt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick thing. To Mike, I guess, I take exception to the way some priorities have been rearranged. When I look at the BOE schedule, when it comes to voting at the RTM level, I'm not speaking for Hal or anybody else, in the back of my mind, I know what I'm looking at. I mean, when I voted down a couple of capital expenditures this year, because in the back of my mind, I'm thinking Riverfield. You know, I know it's coming. And I see your intent to try and manage debt service, but I really want to rely on the Board of Ed that you need Riverfield. That's what I see. So in the back of my mind, when I turn down a boiler for Dwight, I'm pinching pennies because I know the big one's coming. And then when I see something like this, it creates this, I become uncomfortable with what I'm looking at. Where am I going? What am I doing? I understand you have to manage debt service, but I think we should really focus on what the needs are and where the money should go.
I don't disagree, and I think, again, as we get to the end of the presentation, right now, if you want to step through each project, we can do that. We're not setting the priorities for the Board of Ed. In fact, the goal in this is to let the Board of Ed set their own priorities. We needed a model to get to where we're going, and all you're seeing is an interim step. So I think as we get to the end, I think you'll see that that's addressed, and the Board of Ed is the only group setting their priorities. We are not scheduling individual projects in any manner, way, shape, or form.
The sheet seems to indicate you are scheduling. You're moving.
This sheet is not where we're going at. Let us finish. You'll see the spreadsheet at the end. Basically, you need to see the rest of the presentation to see where it ends up.
Okay.
Mr. DeWitt?
So maybe Mr. Tetra's going to have the same answer for me. Is there one big roll-up of all these numbers? I'm looking at Mr. White's usually, as usual, very detailed list.
Yep.
Are we going to combine all these together and see one big town BOE?
You're going to see the waterfall chart, which defines the debt service levels that we're talking about.
Against all projects?
In terms of
combined projects?
Yeah. Let us finish the presentation, and then if you'll come back with that question, we'll address it at that time.
Okay, that's fair.
Any other questions, comments? Seeing none, let's go on. I think we want to go to the waterfalls. Go to the falls.
I think the next critical document is the two-page statement of assumptions, and I think this starts to get to the heart of what Mr. DeWitt just mentioned. These two assumptions refer to what are referred to as waterfall B and waterfall C. And I'd first like to, and members of the Board of Finance at least have met before, and I'd like to acknowledge the great work that Matt Spurndle's done, particularly over the last 36 hours. Thank God I've got him on speed dial. Because Matt's here, who is our financial advisor and has helped us in the last several years from Phoenix Advisors. And the waterfall chart, which was created at the behest of the Board of Finance, is the one that Matt kind of keeps. As you see, we're already up to version 18, and now we've got version 18A, B, and C. And I want to publicly thank Matt for all the fine work that he's done. It's a two-page document. I will walk you across the top. As I said earlier, this takes us out to fiscal 23. The town does have debt obligations that extend beyond fiscal 23. but we felt for discussion purposes, at least it gave us some flavor as to what we're looking at. The first column, called Outstanding Excluding CWF. CWF, just for those, we'll get to CWF in a second, is the Clean Water Fund, primarily for the, excuse me, the work at the renovation and expansion of the water pollution control facility that was completed approximately 10 years ago. This is all the outstanding long-term debt which the town has. The first column, principal, second, interest, total principal of interest. The
Hiller, just a question for the slow guy up here. This is our existing debt as it will be burned down through fiscal year or through calendar year 23.
That is correct,
So-
including in this last year. For example, we paid $12,335,000 in principal payments last year. We are budgeted to pay $12,435,000 of interest payments in the current fiscal year.
And you have not burdened...
Chris, this is everything, Mr. Hiller, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but just to get the answer, this is all the debt that we've either incurred or approved to be incurred, period,
This is what's on the books today.
today. And that's the first part of the waterfall. So if we do nothing else, right, this is what our debt
So if we just pay our bills, don't spend another dime except on the normal, right, we'll be down to paying $8 million in 2023.
If we, you're right, if we stopped and didn't approve one more dollar,
Right.
we are still obligated in fiscal '23 to pay $8,840,000.
Got it. Thank you.
Mr. Smith, can you come sit up there? Yeah, welcome to the table. Ask and you shall receive, right? Thank you.
Okay. I just wanted to make one comment. We've been creating this waterfall for a few years now, and this far left columns that Paul was just talking about is your bonded debt that we've talked about. Since we created this originally, the 2010 bond issue has obviously been finalized. That is maybe 7 columns or so over to the right. So if you, that could very easily be merged into that far left column, but just because we were showing 10 and then 12, just a progression. Right. So you'd really have to take that, those columns to the far left, add the total for the 2010 to really get the outstanding bonded long-term debt service of the town.
And then you need to add in the approved projects, which are the new 2012 bonds, right?
Right, because those are approved.
Because those are approved, there's no other, with the exception of Sherman School, which needs to be approved by the RTM, everything else is approved and done. And so the real total that we would be paying down in 2023 is $17,988,000.
That's correct.
Looking at that.
The number all the way to the right.
Oh, correct.
Under total all.
Right, exactly.
So that's what we would call the baseline if we approve and do nothing else. Yeah.
Just one question on that. Does that also assume a continuation of our short-term note program at or about the same level as
Yes.
$3 million a year and it rolls through?
Yes.
Okay.
That would, I think the two things, to the chairman's point, the two things that are in that number, if you look at the total all and look at the last line number, the 17,988 number, the two things that are in here that aren't approved yet are the 800,000 that was mentioned earlier for Sherman, and as Mr. Kiley has just pointed out, the annual $3 million commitment to the non-recurring capital. Just rolls. That we would continually be taking $3 million for smaller projects. $2 million for the Board of Ed, $1 million for the town.
Thank you.
And what's the second waterfall on the same page then?
The second one, or
Mr.
waterfall
back to you.
18A, the only difference with that is it adds the $4,055,000 to next summer's bond sale which would bring that total up to $39,030,000. And that's, as I said earlier, I referred to it as kind of a placeholder of $4,055,000 for what I've designated as high school work. The windows and the windows at Ludlow, year one of the roof project at Ward, which the Board of Ed contemplates would be over a 4-year period.
Okay, so the top chart is baseline. The bottom chart on the same page adds in $4 million approximately of bonding, used specifically leveled, the high school windows and roof. But in fairness, that could be whatever that is. It assumes $4 million worth of bonding before next May.
Yeah, that's right. That there would be additional approvals for that. And again, the $3 million for the non-recurring
Okay.
Okay.
in the coming 8 months, let's say.
So the waterfalls on the next two pages.
Waterfall 18B, and this, it's a little more difficult for those of us visually impaired.
Me too.
And it does relate also to the assumptions. The two sheets there, waterfall 18B basically adds $7 million annually in long-term projects to the Board of Education. And what I basically call for the foreseeable future. That ties back in part to either of the capital plans. If you look at it from that standpoint, there was and the quick arithmetic on this is, we're committing to $4 million in the current year, another $28 million over the next 4 years, and $10 million over that period of time in short-term debt. What that does is that strings this out, and we show prospective bond issues beyond the one of next summer, in the summer of 14, 16, 18, and 20. The one in 14 being at 26 million, the one in 16 being at 23 million, and then 22 million. When these drop down, it's basically the town piece of that that's dropping down. If you look at on the assumptions on waterfall B, we contemplate $12 million in the next 2 years specifically for the clubhouse renovations at Smith Richardson, purchase of a fire truck, the renovations at the Fairfield Woods Library, and town-wide replacement, including the Board of Ed and public safety of the phone system.
Mr. Mayor.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Hiller, I'm having, I heard what you said, I think, that this adds $7 million a year. Did you say that? That's the question.
It adds this. Go to the assumptions.
If you look at the,
Go to the,
because the acoustics is not that great in here. Looking at the top of B, for example, it says that we're adding 25 million in 10 new bonds, 30 million in 12, 28 million in 14, 23 million in 18, in 16, 22 million in 2018, and another 22 million in 2020.
Correct.
So that's...
And what we're saying is that that's, the consistency is that we're adding 14 million every 2 years in long-term debt for the Board of Education. The variable on this is the town side, which declines fractionally over that period of time. 2 major projects, actually a third major project coming up in fiscal 16, and that is the renovation of Old Town Hall.
Okay.
So-
So we're adding, if you, 55, 105, 150 million over, by 1920, 2020.
Yes. At the same
But that
time,
doesn't seem to, I don't see the 150 million in the total at the end of at the end of the column, though.
well, I think what we're trying to say is that, and some of the projects, particularly on the town side, after fiscal 14, are not really identified, but there are going to be needs. And what we're just trying to do for demonstration purposes are saying, we can't identify at this time. Mr. White has identified some of them here in his work here. We look at 3 major building projects: the library, the clubhouse at the golf course, and the renovation of Old Town Hall. We have a strong need for the replacement of the phone system throughout the town, and again, keeping with the bonding policy to
Okay, no,
purchase a
here's,
fire truck under-
let me ask my question differently, maybe. The first chart says, if I understood that correctly, that if we did nothing, we will have a debt balance of $17,988,000.
That is correct.
Debt service. The debt balance is not on here anywhere. And that debt service goes up by 8 million by, because the number is 25 million, by bonding the $135 million. So you're talking $8 million a year in debt service.
What you're getting, though, is that you're taking on during that, after, if you compare waterfall 18 and waterfall 18B, what you've added is you've added 97 million in debt between now and 2020.
And what is that? Okay, so we're adding $137 million in debt. The debt service goes up by $8 million.
Goes up from essentially 18 million at that point to 25.7
25.
last year.
Because a bunch comes off in 23. Goes up to 30 the year prior to that. And what would our total debt be at that time?
Oh, in terms of principal outstanding as far as par, I'm not 100% sure. I can look because I do have the totals here. You have to keep in mind that obviously, as each year goes by, you're paying off, right now you're paying off, in terms of the principal on bonded projects, 12, 13 million, and as each year goes by, you're paying off, anywhere between 12 and 15 million of principal. So as you add, you're obviously paying off all debt. Where that total principal would be at that 2023 level, I do have the numbers here, but it's not totaled up that way. It's more from a budgetary principal plus interest standpoint. It's something that we could easily get. I mean,
Right, I know, it's some of it's in the fine, but the first schedule shows we're only paying down a principal over the 12-year period. We're only paying off principal of $4 million. That's what it says, right? Outstanding principal, 2011 is 12 million. Outstanding principal, all right,
It's your annual payment.
that's principal payoff. Excuse me, I got confused there for a second. Sorry. Apologize for that. But what I want to say is that, right, okay, never mind. So the principal goes down by 2 million, $1.5 million in 11 years at 3%. We're paying 3%? Not in the schedule.
You have an
Just trying
escalator
to
on here.
follow. I mean,
I was trying to get a feel of how much we actually are paying off each year.
what you're paying off right now each year is, again, it's the far left column. If you're on just the first of these schedules,
principal that
because
we're
it's
paying
bigger
off.
and we can all see it. if you're looking at that far left column, you have principal. Each year you're paying off 12 million 3, 12 million 4. So each year you're paying that down on bonded debt. Plus, we talked about earlier, we have to add in the 2010 bond issue, which has already been done, which is about $1 million, give or take, each year. So that's 13.5 each year on bonded debt that's been bonded already, having nothing to do with anything that's coming up in the future.
Okay, all right, I was misunderstanding something, thank you.
Okay.
So, Mr. DeWitt, go ahead.
I'm actually following you, which is scary. But the one thing that I don't understand is, you said that this is based on a decreasing town side, when this spreadsheet actually shows that the town is increasing. It increases not by a whole lot, but from year 1 to year 5, it goes from 2 to like 4, and then in the fifth, you know, the 2016 and on, it goes up to.
I think, again, for demonstration purposes here, we haven't, kind of merged the two yet. I mean, Mr. White has put this together. We had it last year. The thing I think that we're looking at are what I'll term the big projects that we know are out there. And that there are, whether it be the library trustees or the golf commission, or what we know clearly is a need at Old Town Hall and on the phone system. Those are things that we know are there. We have not, with the exception, we've really, the library trustees have retained some consultancies on Fairfield Woods Library. We did spend $30,000 or $35,000 a year and a half ago on an architect to do some conceptual stuff at the golf course. There was a meeting 2 months ago on that, and that will proceed through the fall and perhaps accelerate. But I think we haven't married the exact time schedule in Mr. White's thing exactly to the schedule. Again, I think what we're trying to do is give some level of magnitude as to where we are, and more importantly, and I think the most important columns here are when you look at the total all as to what happens to your debt service budget.
No, I'm with you. And I don't even know if this is an appropriate question, but do we know what this does to revenue year over year if we just stay the same, we don't do anything, don't spend another dime, revenue is going to have to increase by some amount by taxation given, right? If we do Schedule 1, it goes up 2% more, Schedule 3, it goes up by 10%. I'm curious if we even know what that means, dollars and cents, to the average taxpayer like me.
We haven't, again, that's more of a budgetary debate, and also as each project comes in, is the ability to sustain this level. Clearly, and I think that what's in the back of everyone's mind is that 10% threshold as far as debt service. We're working right now with a $263 million budget. We are fractionally under that 10% level at this point in time. To do that is going to be to take that budget out in successive years. Obviously, over the next 4 months, there's going to be some development of the fiscal 13 budget, which will give us some handle on that. And I think the one thing that you see is that Waterfall 18 shows you the minimum debt service budget for next year of $26,438.
Yeah, I think what Mr. Hiller is pointing out is a couple things. One is that the waterfall chart's a beautiful chart to see where we're going, and to Mr. Bateson's point, look down the road at some of these things. However, the next 12 months, to some degree, that 26.4, even if we don't do anything, that's the debt service number plus or minus that's going to be in the fiscal 13 budget, regardless of what you approve. So and you saw on the chart that if we approved the other $4 million, that would only go up fractionally in fiscal 13. The second piece of this, and Mr. DeWitt, to your point, is if you look at the change, you look at the far right column, you can see the annual change.
Yes.
All right. And if you look at this past year where we had roughly, I'm going to say $225 million raised by tax revenue,
Right.
that means $2,250,000 would basically be 1%. So as you look at that change going up, if that goes up that much, that's pushing upward, in most cases, probably about 0.5%. If it's roughly if it was roughly $1 million between the two, simple math says that would be up 0.5%. So that's one of the budget drivers as we keep having that go up. What we're trying to do is get to the discussion that, okay, how much new debt service do we want to take on? So we've built together two charts here, one that shows, and you can see from the assumption sheet, where we've got kind of page 1 and page 2 there that break out what happens in our last two waterfall charts. 18B shows that if we look at town bonding, for the next 3 years, we can be pretty specific in terms of some of the projects that we're looking at. At least we know the big ones. That doesn't say they're going to be approved. That doesn't say they are approved. That says those are the ones that are coming down the pike, and both need to be more fleshed out. And again, there are just too many examples recently, so I'm going to pick on Sherman again. A year ago, we thought it was 1.6. Today, it's on the table for 3.0. You know all the gyrations we've been in between. Right. A year ago, it was going to be done by now.
Right.
Now it's not going to be done until next year. There was a proposal on the table for a while that would take it out 3 years. So as you're looking at years where this gets done, what we want to do is generate a chart that was flexible enough that would allow the Board of Finance and the RTM to look at things and say, when we're approving this project, let's look at the timing, let's look at this, and we should be bringing you an updated waterfall chart every time we're looking at a bonding project. So you can look at not only what I'm approving today, but what the impact will be on potential tax rates in the future. Now, part of what this is saying is, look, we need some placeholders. We've got some specific projects.
Sure.
We don't know them all. Mr. White's priorities may change. The Board of Ed's priorities may change. So rather than trying to force their projects on them, let's take a look at what they are and give them an allocation, give the town an allocation, so that as we're looking at those approvals come through, because we basically approve a project, then we build a project, then we bond a project. Now, if that project takes 2 or 3 years, like a Fairfield Woods or a Stratfield, there might be a couple of iterative steps in there.
Sure.
However, roughly, and then Paul on the back end looks at that and says, okay, how do we then take that structure and manage that to keep our debt service as level as we can? So those are three components that in essence are perhaps controlled by the boards. And then the fiscal officer looks at that and says, okay, can I level this off a bit so we don't get any big hits and tax hits in any one year? So it's a combination of all those steps. When it's approved, when it's built, how many years it takes to build it, and then we can ban it for up to 3 years in some cases.
Right.
Before we go for the official 20-year bonding, so we have some flexibility in terms of when we layer that in, as Paul referenced earlier.
Right.
But to get to your specific point, if you look at the percentage change, look at $1 million as being roughly 0.5%. That's roughly right, not exactly right. You can start to see what the tax impact of this is. That's why we did the second sheet and said, okay, if we do $7 million a year, given Mr. Hiller did move around some of the project approval dates, the Board of Ed gets, because one of our questions was, we had this whole argument last year about, was enough for the Board of Ed long-range plan in our capital plan? Wasn't it? There was two big divergent numbers that were used, one by the Board of Ed, one by the town. I didn't want to have that fight, didn't want to have that argument. So the first question is, how much does it cost to give the Board of Ed roughly everything, given what's in their plan? Now, the Board of Ed, to their credit, or with a lot of work, has gone back and modified their plan over what it was last year. So I don't mean to sound like they've done a whole lot of homework, realizing the economy we're in and how do we refine these numbers not to put too big a tax burden out there. So we took that and said, okay, can we get everything? And we didn't know. And it came back, yes, for about $7 million a year, the Board of Ed gets all their projects. Now, that still would need some tweaking in terms of timing. But it seems easier to say, look, if we need to move Riverfield up a year because we can get it done earlier, and we can build it quicker, and perhaps we can bond it quicker because rates still make sense to do it. Well, if we build it earlier, then we can reduce some of the money we might bond the next year. So on average, we're still at that $7 million a year number. Because on average, that's where we'd end up. We then took another shot and said, look, What if we don't have an appetite for 7 million a year? Let's reduce that to 5 million. And where does that get us? A little bit of a sensitivity analysis. How much of a difference does that make in our annual bonding numbers? One of the things you see when we use the 7 million number was that the annual debt service keeps going up through 2022.
Right.
If we change it to 5 million, we actually kind of peak and level off, and we have some way of managing that a little bit. All right. So part of the discussion I would envision going on from here is sitting down with Dr. Title and the Board of Ed and looking at kind of what plays out between that in the same way that we might look at the trade-offs on the town side. As much as we're pretty sure on some of the projects coming in, we don't have strict or detailed definitions, and I'm going to pick the library. We have a number in there of 8 million. Is that 8 million? Is that 12 million? Could that be done for 6? What do we get for that? That hasn't passed any of the boards yet. So those definitions and what gets passed could change in terms of how that hits the allocation and when the work is done, because we may choose to spread that out over time as a way to level that debt burden. I don't know what's in the details of the library projection, and the library doesn't know yet. They haven't even requested a building committee to take a look at that or come up with a project scope. So the idea was to come up with something that would provide a flexible framework so that each of the bodies that approves this has some framework of saying, okay, if I approve this, what's that going to do to the debt service and, in essence, the tax rate? Because sooner or later, when somebody says we can't afford it, what they're really saying is that drives up the tax rate too much. And we wanted to provide a framework that was, one part, easy enough to understand, that didn't get us micromanaging the Board of Ed, gave them the flexibility to move things, and if they needed to make an exception, because everything we're putting down here is a guideline. If they need to make an exception, then they're coming to the board saying, look, we know this is an exception. We know we're going over the guideline that you guys gave us. Let's have that discussion, then let's talk about the project, too. Does that help in terms of the framework?
It does, but you know as well as everyone else on this board that our frustration with capital plans always is, we get one capital plan in 2009, and then something gets added, it increases. And I understand exactly what you're saying, but I'm wondering if we can use this same data to say, let's project I'm going to make a number up, a 1% increase of budget every year. That is a number, $15 million, whatever it is, and that's it. And when we have the 8 millions that turn into 12 millions, that's 8 million. When the Shermans turn from 2 to 2 to 4, it's 2.2. We're capping it rather than what I think you're explaining is you're showing us how we have a plan, and then when we deviate from the plan, we just get a new plan.
No.
We know what the plan is. We know the 20-year impact of the new plan, but we're not capping the plan.
Yeah. I think what this does is give us a way to do just what you want. This basically says, look, here are the debt service numbers on an annual basis, all right? And we know now how much we approve in dollars that stay within that. We also know if those projects go up, we can then push off projects in later years. We can now manage the project flow, if you will.
Yep.
All right? Up until now, we've always tried to do it by reducing the one project, which might be one way to do it.
Right.
But it's not the only way, because you want to manage what we're spending on debt, not what we're spending on the project.
Sure.
So
Gotcha.
Let me,
Thank you.
let me see if I can state it a slightly different way, just to make sure I understand it correctly. The waterfall we're looking at, the one that you're referring to is version 18B, I guess. In general, here's the assumptions. Over an 8-year period, $24 million in non-recurring capital, $37 million in town bonding related to projects related to town and town infrastructure and town properties, and $48 million related to Board of Education bonding. And that's all over an 8-year period. You divide that up, it's $3 million a year on non-recurring. It's $7 million a year on Board of Ed. The town side, it's on average $4 million. There's a couple outlier years for a couple of bigger projects there, a total of $5 million. So, Mr. DeWitt, to your question, that would argue that to say within this capital service, right, in order to hit the numbers on the total all, on the right side of the schedule, you would roughly be allowed, quote-unquote, your cap would be $14 million worth of bonding a year. And presumably, you gentlemen put that together, saying this would give us essentially everything you need on the town side, theoretically, and it would fully fund the long-term facilities plan, as far as you know, for the Board of Education over the next 6 to 8 years, all right? Okay, but what that does do is it raises your annual debt expenditures above the levels we now are, and therefore, presumably, or it would be above that 10% line, depending on what happens with operating expenses in the town as a whole.
This would be one of the drivers for that, so it's a catch-22.
Exactly. Turn to the next page. The next page relates to version 18C, which is the bottom version. This allows for the $3 million in non-recurring capital a year for 8 years, or $24 million. The same $37 million on the town side. You guys are letting yourself off easy on that one. And you've shaved back the Board of Ed side to $40 million. So the total spending there is $101 million over that 8-year period versus $109 million, all the savings coming from the Board of Ed side on that. And what that would do is that would give you an annual cap of new bonding of $12 million. So we would say you could approve projects that would add $12 million of bonding each year on average for that 8-year period. Now, what that does to your debt service, if you look at it, well, it goes down in some years, up in others. It keeps it at least closer to that $27 million mark where we're already at. It doesn't improve our quote-unquote debt level position, but it doesn't grow the debt level position, right? And what it does is fund all of your town side, your $3 million a year non-recurring, right? And
And if I might,
most of your Board of Ed side.
and if I might, Mr. Chair, one of the reasons we didn't tweak the non-recurring is so much of that is maintenance. We've done so much building. We want to make sure that the maintenance numbers are there, because we want to protect what we have.
Right. Why didn't you tweak the town side?
We actually talked about that. I think that from a longer-term perspective, we were worried about some of the aging structures on the town side that we don't have a good handle on now, the police, some of the fire department needs, that may be some bigger numbers. We do have the town hall number in here, and again, the caution on all these is there's no detailed, spec behind that. That's our best guess as to what ballpark that should be in for right now. So we were concerned going out. Also looked at this and said, really, it's the next 2 or 3 years that we're really using this for, because we're going to revise it 3 times before we get out to the 4th year here.
Right. So the question that becomes before this body, as well as the other bodies, when they go to approve each and every project is, where does it stand in relation to that annual cap? Right? As well as, is that annual cap too high? Because it's not like we're all agreeing on the annual cap. That annual cap, some people may say, and decide that annual cap should be $8 million a year, $9 million a year. Others could be very comfortable with that $12 million a year, and others could say it'd be $14 million a year. But the reality is it gives you a framework for saying, if you bond that much in this year, this is what it's going to do for the debt service on a go-forward basis. So it provides a context, correct?
That's correct, Mr. Chairman, and I think the other thing, too, really the only difference, and, we can split this any way, which way we want to. As you say, we've kept, on Waterfall C, we've hit Dr. Title for $2 million. That's a call of this board and the RTM as to who gets what. I think for comparative purposes, what the difference between B and C says is we're taking $4 million less over each 2-year cycle. And I think what you do is you get a comparative number there that you can look at when you get into that total all thing that becomes of value for budgeting purposes.
Right. I want to turn to our colleagues from the Board of Education and Dr. Title. Does this provide a better context for what we're dealing with on the town side related to how these capital decisions impact the annual budget.
I understand the model.
But, I feel a but coming.
Well, the $2 million Board of Ed non-recurring capital has been fiction,
Right,
so that's...
because it wasn't approved this year.
Right, or last year.
That's what I
Before
mean.
came. It
That's
wasn't
what I mean.
just me. And, knowing that each project going forward is going towards some sort of cap is helpful to us.
Yeah.
That really does help us manage it, and we can stay within whatever number. We just have to have assurances on the other side that we stay within that and the proposal is reasonable, that we can move forward with the priorities. So, in the past, we've had a cap, and then it gets scaled back. That's my thought on it. I obviously, and I should point out, and I think you made reference to it, the Board of Ed started out with a list of priorities that was even greater than this, and scaled it back, and to chagrin of some people, specifically those at Mill Hill, pushed some projects out beyond the 2015 year. And so, we really feel this is, our greatest priorities, but obviously, if we don't get the allocation that's there, we'll just march through the priorities. This is my recommendation would be, you march through the priorities to whatever the allocation is. And that may just push things out. But it doesn't really change the priorities. So,
So the
I'm
Board of-
fine with the, and I really appreciate the attempt of modeling, if we bonded for the Board of Ed what they wanted, what the impact would be. I think that's a really useful exercise for everybody to see, and what the difference is between 5 million and 7 million and everything else. I think that's very, very helpful. But my concern is going to be the process.
Right, we're going to get to that.
Right.
Yeah. Mr. Mottola, do you have anything you'd like to add?
No, I don't think I really have anything to add to what Dr. Title said. My concern would be a few years out that there's assurances from the other town bodies, if we go this route, that we're going to be getting those funds. And that's the problem I've seen over the last few years. We haven't gotten what we thought we were supposed to be getting. And that just, and I understand things can change. That's just the reality. So that would be the one concern I would have.
Thank you, Mr. Mottola. Mr. Stone, I saw your hand.
Are we looking for a dollar cap, or shouldn't it be a percentage of the budget type cap?
Right.
I don't know.
Well, we spent a lot of time last year at this talking about that magical, mystical 10% of your overall budget. And as Mr. Tetro had called out, we right now have about a $260 million budget or so. So that magical cap on today's dollars would be about $26 million in debt service. So I think that, at least when I look at it, and that's the only way I can answer it, Mr. Stone, is for myself, when I look at page 2, I look at it and say the $14 million a year well exceeds that $26 million number kind of in perpetuity. The lower number, and I'm not saying that I agree with this, I'd have to give this more thought as we move forward, but that lower number actually comes closer to that $26 million, that $27 million. I've got you, Mr. Tetra. That's kind of the way. So I'm looking at both the whole dollars and keeping the percentage in the back of my mind. That's how I'm doing it. That's how I can. I think I saw Mr. Brockfeld. Okay, Mr. Mayor?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I misunderstood something earlier that was said, so I got off track, but I think I'm back on track. Some interesting numbers. If you think about our current budget, which you just says 263, which includes debt service, so the operating budget is around 240.
Yep.
And if you extrapolate 240 at 4% a year to 2023, you're at $360 million. And the $25 million, or whatever this number is, would be about 7% of that. So the kind of interesting news there is, thinking about an operating budget of $360 million, but the percentage does come down.
You said that, not me. I'm going to go to Mr. Brockfeld, and then I want to recognize Mr. Brown, who's been waiting patiently.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. The only concern I have, I see where we're going with this, and the only, I'm just talking out loud, but is that the Board of Ed in particular needs some kind of clarity, I think, in terms of going forward, and they deserve it in terms of what their allowance is, to use a terrible word. But at the same time, what I'm worried about is that if we, and none of this obviously is law, but if we start making promises or assurances that there'll be X dollars a year because it fits into some scenario that we're comfortable with in terms of debt service, and then we're not allowing, in other words, Mr. Mayor just, extrapolated out of 4% a year, that's one number, it could have been 7% or 1%, right? Or we could hit another terrible rough patch in the economy, or we could have, God forbid, some big problems with our pension funds that require us to put in a lot more money than we expect, or the health care stuff could, go up at higher expenses than we expect. So, and then all of a sudden, because I've seen this happen, then I hear the school board come back to us and say, you promised us X, Y, or Z, and so I'm just a little worried that one place we're going with this is to make a promise is the wrong word, but kind of an assurance, and that because one part of my mind says that the right way to do this is to simply come up with some sort of guidelines and let them handle their own affairs, right? In other words, what do we know really when it comes down to it about what projects should be approved or not approved, or how much they should cost? I'm oversimplifying it, but and at the other side of the coin, though, is what I'm concerned about is saying, okay, you have $5 million a year to spend. That's my point. Just to boil it down, or $7 million, or $4 million, or whatever we come up with, and then finding ourselves in a box where we can't spend that much that year because something has happened that we didn't expect.
Yeah, if I might, I think that this is a workshop. We're not voting on this in any stretch. This is, in essence, is a big sensitivity analysis that shows, hey, if these things happen, here's what the numbers are, and here's what it drives debt service. To Mr. DeWitt's point earlier, if we approve these things up to these levels, that's going to drive debt service, and that's what's going to increase the budget, and that's how this rolls out. I mean, in essence, that's the question we've always asked. I think the goal is to change the process, to include this sheet along with every project we get. So then we're looking at not only the project, which has to be justified. Every project coming through, you're going to approve. It much like, and again, I'm going to pick on Sherman again. You looked at that, there was a 3.9 number in front of you, and it was cut back to 3 million. Okay, done for a number of justifications, not to revisit that, but that's the process for every single number that's going to come forward. So if a project comes forward that is not, I guess I'll go with worthy because I can't remember what Mr. Mayor said earlier. Worthwhile? If it's worthy, if it's not worthy, it's not going any further. It may not even get to you because it may stop at the Board of Selectmen, or it may stop at the Board of Ed because it may not get past them in terms of their priorities. What this does is get us all on the same page with a framework that says if we're approving things along these lines, here's what it's doing to the tax increase. And again, this is year 2 of having waterfall charts. This is a tool we didn't have until 12 months ago. So we're just starting to use this. I think it's invaluable in terms of what we do. I think it's an invaluable way to look at things. It gets us off the project-by-project mode, which I think all of us have complained about. RTM, Board of Finance, Board of Selectmen. We got to stop looking at things one day at a time, one project at a time. This lets us get there. It lets us put things in a larger framework. These things will all change. Mr. Brackfeld, I'm going to pick on one of your favorite topics. We made some assumptions on interest rates going forward. Those look good today. 3 years from now, those could be dramatically different. They could be lower, they could be much higher, and they certainly have been much higher in the past. When you do that, that's going to impact our debt service on an annual basis. You start rippling those things out, these numbers grow dramatically. So the issue becomes we're always going to change this. This is always going to be a moving target. Part of the rationale for picking the $5 million a year and part of the rationale for looking at that was saying, look, we've all heard that since 2001, when we had $80 million in debt, I know, Mr. Mayor, you and I worked on that Financial Planning Advisory Committee. Mr. Kiley, were you on that? I don't know if anybody else was, but we started with $80 million in debt. There was a plan put together and a committee put together to look at what the impact of building all these schools was going to be when that debt drives up to $250 million or whatever it peaked at. I'm kind of looking for when that starts to go away. We know we've done all this building. We know we've kind of stopped, though not totally. When does that big number start to go down so this isn't such a big driver going up? So that's what we're trying to get to here. What do we do to kind of cap that off or limit that from a dollar amount? There's no ordinance, there's no charter component that drives us to follow any of these guidelines, but it does help us, I think, at every board, at every level, to make an informed decision. It helps the Board of Ed to drive their plan, and I think if this doesn't fit within their plan, then they're coming in with a discussion or argument or presentation up front, which is why we should exceed the guideline. But we're having the right discussion, I think, at that point. It's like the Dwight boiler. To me, the right discussion would have been not whether we approve it or not. Are we just bumping that back to next year? Did we just increase next year's because we're going to buy 2 boilers then for Dwight and somebody else? Did we bump the whole Dwight boiler maintenance program off a year and now that's the discussion we should have had, unless we actually thought that boilers should last 70 years and not 49, and we thought that was only halfway through its useful life. I think that there's another level of discussion independent of that, and frankly, if you look at this, approving the Dwight boiler last year may have been the most cost-effective time to do it based on the interest rates and what other stuff we had coming. If you look at that as just a one-up discussion, you can't make that decision. I think this helps it make it, and again, I think to me, the waterfall chart is one of the best tools, and I think we have to use this extensively going forward to help us manage these decisions.
Yeah, very quickly, because I want to go to Mr. Brown.
And I agree with everything you just said, by the way, and I just want to repeat the only thing I would say is, as we come out, I know this is just the beginning process of a workshop, is that I just wanted to make sure that the Board of Ed wasn't potentially getting a message that we were going to just at least verbally say that there was an amount that we were comfortable bonding or capitalizing on an annual basis over the next 8 years, as if that was some sort of promise. Because that would be unfair to any party. That was my only point, because I felt like we were kind of easing in that direction, even if we weren't intending to.
Mr. Mottola.
Yeah, I mean, as soon to be an ex-Board of Ed member, I mean, ideally, we would like those assurances, but we're very sensitive that things can change. I think the Board of Ed over the last 2 or 3 years has been very, very sensitive about the situation we all of us have been in with respect to the economy. And as I believe Dr. Teitel said, we scaled back the facilities plan substantially because of the situation that we're in today and have been over the last few years. So, I think this is a great tool, great planning tool. It's something that we can hopefully plan on, but knowing in the back of our minds and future board members' minds that things could change. Things could get better, hopefully, or things could get worse, hopefully not. But I think most board members are sensitive to that.
I'm going to go to Mr. Brown. Thank you for being patient, Mr. Brown.
So my question is, and maybe it is to Mr. Tetreault, or maybe it's to the board. The gross funding, like there's an initial number we had last year. Mr. Flato presented. I know this is history, but I'm getting it off this worksheet. It's the First Selectman's plan recommendation. It's a capital financial plan. And he just laid out basically what he felt the town could afford, and he titled it gross funding. So the question is, who should determine, originally anyway, what the gross funding should be, which will then, I guess, relay over to the waterfall chart.
I think that using the waterfall chart creates a framework to look at that. When I'm looking at this, yeah, I'd like to see us stay closer to the $5 million a year on the Board of Ed side. We'll take a look at the town side and see if we can drop that down a bit too. But I think I'm looking at taking the debt service and stopping that from being a driver for tax increases. All right? And a way to do that is to make sure it doesn't go up much beyond where it is. We're already locked in at $26.5 million for next year, for fiscal 13 rather. Right?
Okay, so you're going from the waterfall chart back to the gross fund.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because if you look at the financial plan we were presented with last year, Didn't include the $5 million for the Metro Center. It has 1.6 for Sherman, not 3.0, and certainly not the 5.0 Sherman would have been if it wasn't in the FEMA zone. For years, the senior center roof wasn't on there. We used to go through and look at that and kind of count up all the things that weren't included in that. So it seems to me the reverse way makes the most sense, which is here's the allocation, here's how much additional debt we feel we can add to hit the tax rate targets we're talking about, because affordability is really tax increases.
Okay, I would agree with that. The only thing I would add is, in years past, the first selectman and the Board of Ed weren't even close on the number. I mean, if you look at last year, the Board of Ed, what Mr. Flato presented was 19 million.
Yep.
And I think in those 4 years, the Board of Ed is at 24 million. So somehow I think there has to be, we have to come to terms with an agreement on the number.
Yeah. It's not,
Sorry?
sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, go ahead.
It's not somehow. It's called communication.
Right.
All right, Dr. Title and I have already started talking. We talked about the framework for the process. We'll come out of here. What was frustrating to me is last year, there didn't seem that much communication from the workshop to the budget process. Dr. Title's already committed to meet on a regular basis so we can work through this. And I think the idea is to come here with a much more unified position in terms of here's what we're recommending and here's why. That you're right, we can't survive another year of non-communication. There's got to be a better way.
Yeah, but somehow I meant the communication. It just wasn't there.
Yeah, and this is going to be an evolution process, and any 1 year, you know, a compelling case or an emergency. If you go back a few years, McKinley School was not exactly on a long-range plan to rebuild from scratch. All right? It came up. We had to deal with it. If some of these storms had been worse, we might have had some significant projects at different schools to address. There's got to be some flexibility how we do that and some way to change the priority and potentially to bump these guidelines if we need to do it. But everything is getting looked at a lot more closely. One of Mr. Hiller's tasks before leaving the office on Friday before the hurricane was to answer a 10-point questionnaire from Moody's on, you know, did we have this, and this in line financially for the hurricane and potential damage. When he came back, he had another 10-point questionnaire from Moody's to answer about, is this, and this ready, and do you have this kind of reserves, and what are you taking place? Everybody is looking a lot closer at the financial balance sheet and where we are. When we talked with S&P last summer and talked about the waterfall chart, talked about this workshop, talked about how we communicate among the boards, they were actually pretty impressed. This is not normal for most towns. So my compliments to the Board of Finance, RTM, Board of Selectmen, in kind of pulling this together and having this session and being willing to have this discussion in this framework.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Mr. Bateson first and then Mr. DeWitt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to follow up on something quick that Mike said. I remember in 2001 when we took the leap into debt because of all the school needs that we faced. And really, at that time, I agreed. There really was no choice with the amount of projects we had to go, and we had to borrow to get those done because the tax increases would have been staggering. I agree with you, and I see that debt that we have on the books now. I saw that at that time as being something temporary, like having a mortgage on your house. Someday this is going to be over. We're getting close to that point with those big numbers that are in there, that, 210 million. Since we're starting to work our way through that principle and amortize down those balances, I would like to see us start thinking long-term and actually progressing to like deleveraging, not living with a stable debt level, but deleveraging slowly, kind of along the lines of what we did with the paving program. I understood what First Selectman Flato was doing. Nobody wanted huge increases, but I think if the taxpayer knows what we're doing, and that, let's say we need $7 million a year, $10 million a year for education, we start putting some of that into the budget, more of it. Ours, I never understood in the RTM on the town side why we had, you know, capital bonding for all these projects. Why don't we pay as we go? I understood it because we wanted to moderate tax increases. But I think long-term, I want to start seeing us bring stuff, real stuff, stuff like that back into the budget, and maybe start a program where we did with paving, where we can start moderating, deleveraging the town. I know the first decade might be painful, but I think, you know, in the long-term interest of the town, it might be best.
If I might, Mr. Chair?
Tim?
I think Mr. Bateson raises a good point. I think this workshop allows that discussion to take place. Up until now, we only talk about this stuff one project at a time. I think the great thing about this workshop is we can have just that discussion, because I don't see another point in the approval process of any of these projects where we need to have that discussion. And if we look at trading this off, the waterfall chart gives us a tool to look at what those trade-offs are, both on debt service and then coupling this back into what the prospective tax increases might be that fund that, and how much pain can we withstand, to use your analogy there, in terms of making that transition. There were times in Fairfield's distant past where we actually built a school for free, or not for free, for cash, for no interest. There are, at the moment, I think the only town, and Mr. Hiller might be better up on this, is Greenwich. I think does some of that now, but pretty much everybody else, and especially in today's interest rate environment, is doing this. But Mr. Bateson, your point, think about 5% or 6% interest rates, or 8 or 10%. All of a sudden, your argument starts to make a lot more merit, and it's financially easier, perhaps, to take a long, hard look at, to save 10% a year in interest on top of what we're doing, rather than 0.19 or something along those lines. So I think it's good. I think that would be a healthy discussion to have.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you. Mr. DeWitt?
Representative Bateson is absolutely correct. I'll tell you, I'm proud that I was on the board when we had the foresight to do this, the paving, the way we did, and I'm proud of the RTM for seeing that same, how that was going to help us in not the first year, not the third year, but the 10th and 15th year out. But this tool is great. This is our second year of workshop. I challenge us, the next administration, the next Board of Finance, hopefully I'm still here to make comment on, we should make this September meeting our set the cap for next year meeting. I also agree that we just can't let the Board of Ed be the Stuckey for 10% or 90%. You know, there has to be some even division of that, right? The tool can help us set a cap so we keep on our 10% projection, you know, our 10% debt ratio. That becomes a number, 14 million, or I forget the other number you quoted. Let's call it 14 million. Mm-hmm. And every year we take that 14 million and we parse it out. And when the $4 million project turns to 5, the $1 million project goes away. That's the way, listen, I had to pay $1,000 to have a tree cut down because the hurricane blew it over. Guess what? I'm not getting a new grill this year. It's just kind of, you know, the facts of life. We need to set a cap, use this meeting, use this tool, set a cap, set our limits, and move forward on this every year.
Thank you, Mr. DeWitt. Any other questions? Mr. Tetra?
Yeah, and again, I think that this sets that up. If you look at probably either one of these, but certainly the C spreadsheet, that keeps us well under the 10% number. I mean,
yes, it does.
We did not really look at the 10% number as a guideline. Having been here when we built out all this, I keep looking for when's the debt service go down, when's the bonding go down. I understood it, as Mr. Bateson said, from 2001 to some point it goes up, that's great, but at some point we're done building. Not totally, it doesn't go to zero, but it ought to start stepping down. We ought to start paying off more debt than we're adding every year. So that's what we were trying to get to in here, is kind of what that number is, and that, you know, incrementally 12 million a year kind of gets us to that point. So we're no longer going up with the budget at that 10% level. The debt service is kind of staying level. The budget may go up for other reasons, but debt service is no longer the driver increasing taxes.
That number would be that 12 million. The other side to that is, to Mr. Bateson's point, one way to start beginning that process, because it would be a transition process, would be looking at that non-recurring capital each year and saying how much of that should go into the operating budget versus the capital budget. That'd be the smaller projects that you would start looking at. Now,
Yeah, I think that would give you the most leeway in.
yeah, it would.
Right.
And in fairness, and the first selectman's absolutely right in bringing this up earlier, you are at a time frame of historically low interest rates. And so when you have this meeting, whether it's annually or it's every 6 months, depending on when the need arises, it is prudent to look at what's going on in the interest rate environment, because that'll clearly determine what you want to do and what you want to fund in the operating budget versus when you're getting money at historically low rates and allowing your taxpayers to keep their money a little bit longer. So that I don't think we can ever forget that, or at least whoever's sitting here can never forget that when they're making these type of decisions as to operating versus capital. Any other questions, comments, concerns right now? Dr. Tidal.
I just want to say, I understand that the town took on a huge amount of debt when it built additional schools, and I don't anticipate, I can't see down the line here over the next 4 years, there's no new school on this list, but the existing schools, the 2 million square feet, the 17 buildings that the town owns, that are used by 10,000 kids and 1,500 employees and the town, they just are going to need ongoing significant repairs that just can't be handled in our operating budget without blowing it up. You know, roofs and windows and these kinds of things. I just want to point out that none of these projects actually on the Board of Ed side adds a bunch of capacity to our schools. It's really renovating existing space, and we did have a study completed last year about the infrastructure in the schools and what the needs were, and really outlined in gory detail the deficiencies. So I know it's kind of frustrating because you felt like, oh, you know, we built the new high school, we built this, we built another elementary school, shouldn't this go down? But there's just major upkeep costs to these buildings that we have to come to grips with. And if the decision is to try to move some money from the short-term projects, non-recurring, into the operating budget over time, you know, we can accommodate that as long as when we bring our operating budget forward, we can point out that this increase is due to the change in the procedures. So we're willing to play it either way. I just don't want people to think that because we're done sort of building new schools that all of a sudden this should drop off the table.
Well, you know, it's a very valid point, and to that argument, and it was raised earlier, these projects, when they come before any town body, have to be looked at as to whether you're just delaying a project that eventually is going to need to be done.
Right.
Right? I mean, because you're not really saving money. You're saving the allocation. You're saying, I'm not going to pay for it now, I'm going to pay for it later. But eventually you are going to pay for it. So I think that was a couple of the challenges over the last couple of years within the budget process. There's been more delayed spending than reduced spending in certain areas because of that, to your point. Ms. Stenning.
As a follow-up to what Dr. Tidal was saying, I agree with you. You have to maintain those buildings, and that's one of the things a year, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I think, I've each year said that it would be nice to pull all the maintenance out of the Board of Ed budget and keep that as separate with the town. Then you could get economies of scale when you have to buy certain items, try to buy the same items when you're choosing materials to replace. So I would love to have that discussion with you, or have the next first selectman have that discussion and try to pull those things all together, get somebody to be in charge of all the management of all the town buildings, because those are town buildings too.
Thank you, Ms. Stenning.
And I'm not opposed to economies of scale in purchasing. That goes back to the purchasing discussion. But even buildings that are well-maintained efficiently by the proper staff, over time, you got to sink money into them. So we have an excellent preventative maintenance program. Despite that, roofs are going to run out. And so it's just, so I think there could be some cost avoidance potentially in what you described, but these big numbers, there's nothing we can do to rehab, Riverfield.
Right.
All right? It's an old, tired, sad building that desperately needs an overhaul. And these things are going to be coming up in some sort of rotation, because we get a lot of buildings with a lot of square foot that get a lot of use.
Any other questions, comments, concerns? All right, so the discussion, has it been helpful? And should this be something that's done more than annually? That's the first thing I want to follow up on. Mr. DeWitt?
Well, I agree with Mr. Tetra. At least every time a new capital comes up, we should see a new waterfall. I'm completely on board with that.
Yep, I think we're all agreed on that.
Right.
How about the actual summit itself? Should we do it more often than annually?
The actual, sorry?
Summit with all the boards? To see where we are with the new waterfall?
It feels like it would be better at 6 months, but that's just me.
Okay. Any other, Mr. Tetra?
Mr. Chair, I think it's a function of what happens in between.
Yep.
If we went through and say we approved 3 or 4 different projects in the next 6 months, then it might be healthy to sit down and say, okay, where are we now and what did we just do to ourselves? Even though we're doing it each time. I think if there are not a lot of approvals now in the next 6 months, then perhaps this didn't change much. And that might not, unless in your mind or the board's mind, there was a reason to have another strategy session or perhaps take up Mr. Bateson's point of, is there a way to start to trade off some of this bonding and can we work it into the operating budget and focus perhaps just on that question for a bit?
Another thing is if there's a dramatic change in the economy, such as we saw a couple of years back, and we need to react to that and reset some of the standards that have been discussed, something beyond our control. Mr. Bolito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that this is very helpful in terms of giving us a framework as far as the dollars and cents go and the overall debt service. I do have one suggestion about something that we might add, and that is to set some sort of specific priorities for projects, not just for the Board of Ed, but also for the town side, because one of the things that causes some confusion is which projects get bumped, why did they get bumped. There's no specific set of priorities as to what projects are at the top of the list and which are at the bottom of the list. Something like, for example, public safety would seem to be something that's at the top of the list. Capacity, when you're talking about the schools, increased capacity, certainly that would be something that you put at the top of the list. The way the building is used in terms of its, how it's used on a daily basis and improving the flow of things. Those are things that you could put into a document where everyone who has a project could go and say, okay, we know what the priorities are. We know that if we got this type of project, it's going to be toward the top of the list or toward the bottom of the list, and given how things go, it might get bumped or it might go to the top of the list. That's the one element that has been kind of, we've touched on it, but it hasn't been specifically dealt with, and I think that's a piece of the puzzle that going forward we do need to address. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bolito. Do you have other questions, comments? Mr. Schwartz.
Thank you. Just from a RTM perspective, I think this has been great, but as we all know, the RTM is the last body to see 90% of these projects, and it's usually, as we use the terminology, with a gun to our head. If this discussion can be taken to the body prior to or even as early as the project starts, we can start getting this information. This is passed out to the body. At least they have the information in front of them. I get a package 5 days before I'm supposed to vote on it, and it's not fair to 48 other people that are sitting in that room saying, okay, but we only know what we heard in the paper because I wasn't able to go to the Board of Finance meeting. I get a Board of Finance package, but that's always prior to your meeting. So the information that's coming out of here is fabulous. I think this is great. I'd like to see this, every 6 months. I'd love to see the other 48 members of the RTM sitting in here and listening to this, because this is a world of information. I think all of this needs to go out to the whole body. Everything that we got presented here, I think the other 48 members of the RTM deserve to take a look at and see, and then they can come back with questions, and maybe you guys can give them some answers, because I know the two of us can't come up with everything. But on that perspective, I think if the information comes out to us, because we are the last line of defense, we are the last people that are going to vote on it, and 90% of the time it's a yes or no vote based on what the information that we have 5, 6, maybe 10 days prior to a vote. So anything that you can get to the body that's ahead of time, I think is good, and I think this is invaluable to the decision that the RTM's going to make as well as the Board of Finance.
Thank you, and what a great transition, because the next part of the meeting, and I want to do it quickly, and the goal here is not to make any decisions, but to raise this as a topic and recognize this as an issue. Last week at the Board of Education meeting, it was discussed that there's become a bottleneck within our approval process of projects, where I think for the right reasons, the town boards, whether it be the Board of Finance, the Board of Selectmen, and/or the RTM, at given intervals, have asked the Town Facilities Commission to become involved in review of projects before they get approved, and have sometimes asked for some outside evaluations of projects, again, for the right reasons, to make sure that there was best available information to the town bodies so they can make an informed decision. What's happened with that, however, is, as evidenced by the handout that Dr. Title gave out earlier today and discussed last week, and is discussed separately with myself, is that we've jammed a lot down on our volunteers, whether it be the Town Facilities Commission or what have you, and we've really caused, or our board or the Board of Selectmen, whatever, we've caused bottlenecks within getting projects moved along and approved. And we need to resolve that. It's not fair to the RTM. It's not fair to the Board of Education. It's not fair to our constituents who are waiting for some type of decision on that project. So we need to streamline it, we need to formalize it, and we need to follow it. And we need to provide those guidelines out. Now, I'm not suggesting I have the answers to that as we sit here, but I think the first part of that is recognizing that there's an issue. I mean, Mr. Tetro, you would agree that there's an issue on that? And the thought would be that we request that a committee be formed by the various town bodies to review what that process should be. And I'd leave it to the first selectman. I'd like to hear opinions on it, but whether that should be somebody from the Board of Selectmen, somebody from the Board of Finance, someone from the town facility, someone from the Board of Education, and really get that process set up so, as you said, the proverbial gun is taken away from your head, so that some of this information is in your hands more quickly, as well as in our hands, because funny enough, I think we've seen that same gun, as well as so the Board of Education knows what they can report back out. So I'd like some thoughts on that, as it were. I'm not a big one for forming all sorts of subcommittees, although I've done it a lot recently.
I'm glad you're not.
You also don't follow through on your beer promises.
Right, exactly.
Start at November 9th.
But I think this is one that screams out for some type of cooperation amongst the town bodies to provide better guidance. Mr. Tetra, did you have something on that?
I concur completely. I think that we need to take a look at this process, take it apart, and put it back together. I think that it's got to move through on a more timely basis. I would argue that our citizens need us to move faster than this. Certainly, if there are kids out there expecting things, we've got to move along. We're wasting a lot of time in these committees, in the Board of Ed, in the RTM, kind of looking at the same projects over and over and over again.
Yep.
So happy to move forward on that, and I think it would be good to have all three bodies represented as well as the Board of Ed. So we come up with something that would come back to all three bodies with a presentation on a revised process in terms of how to make sure things move through on a timely basis. So the second time you're hearing about something, you haven't forgotten what it was.
Yep. Dr. Tyler?
No, I agree with both comments. The process isn't working well for anybody. And we need to do it sooner rather than later.
Yep.
If we're going to use the same model of, say, the $2 million non-recurring, I mean, that's where we got hung up with a number of projects. If we need to do something differently in terms of presenting those, or even if we need to do something differently before the Board of Ed even gets them, we present these to the Board of Ed in January because under the timeline that we tried to stay with, you wanted to handle these projects pre-budget, pre-operating budget discussion. So if we want to stay on that timeline, then my sense would be we need to meet, early December to nail this down because we're going to have projects in the hopper, and if we're going to define, say, the 10 essential questions every project needs answered before it moves forward, we just need to know this, I think, sooner rather than later. I've always said all along, we just need to know what the rules are, what the standards are, and I'm sure we can meet them and we can accommodate that. We want people to have the information. I would be so frustrated as an RTM member getting it at the end of the process. I mean, we go through the same presentation on a project like 6 times. I mean, isn't there a way to have a process where everybody can hear it all at once and ask their questions and move along? I mean, it just seems like there's things like that maybe we could put on the table for discussion purposes in terms of the whole process, because otherwise you get to the end of the project and RTM knows what they got in the packet and what they might have read in the paper. That might be it. And it's a tough way to make a decision. I agree.
Thank you. Mr. Bates?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with Dr. Title in everything that was just said. I think several RTM members should be involved in that, or a couple in that committee. I think it's great. I see what you're saying, Dr. Title. I mean, there's been a couple of things that I have followed from Acorn to Tree, and I could tell you, not your frustration, but frustration on presenters. This is the 7th time you've explained it. And I feel bad for my brethren that are sitting next to me, and it's their first time hearing it. I understand. I get that. And I think there should be a way that we could do that to make it easier on everyone.
Thank you. Anyone else? Ms. Stank?
You know, on that same thought, Mr. Bateson and Dr. Title, I've noticed that as we go through the process, there are usually some really good questions that come up at the first meeting, and then some follow-up questions at the second meeting. And in between, there are answers to those questions that I think we all think, okay, that's answered, good. And the same group of people who were at the first meeting come to the next meeting, know those answers, and are like bored by the fact that we have to hear it again, or the same questions get asked and things are getting confused. It might be useful if after the first meeting, for those important questions that came up, you list the frequently asked questions type of thing, give a paragraph that gives the explanation to those questions that were really troublesome in each of the preceding meeting. I think it would make meetings go smoother. Everybody could read those if they went out prior to the meeting or with the minutes. They could, absorb that and be able to ask the next level of questions. Because over time, I mean, I know at the Board of Selectmen, we pass some things sometimes to get it to the next level so that the information can be obtained, get to you to ask that next level. But there are plenty of things that we found out the answers to that we could just here's the answer to this. That'll save you 3 hours of discussion.
Yeah. Any other questions, comments, concerns? Mr. Bateson?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to follow up on Sherry's point. You're right. I noticed, I can't remember what it was. Maybe it was the capital projects we dealt with in the Metro Center. There was a lot of information flying around. You guys, Mike, I guess it was you that was addressing stuff on the fly and sending us emails. There was a lot of the times, and I think TFC did when they answered some questions on capital projects during the budget season, that I would read that and it was like, oh yeah, I had that question. So asked and answered, move on. So if there's some way that we can legally, not getting into FOI issues, address what Sherry said, it worked for me. There was a lot of questions that were answered prior to going to an RTM meeting.
And I think it's also, I agree with that. I also think we need to be fair to our members of the TFC who we rely on for their expertise and their knowledge. I mean, you talk about putting a gun to your head. There's been several different bodies within this town that has referred things to the TFC and said, an answer yesterday would be good. And all the while they're serving on other building committees and taking hours and hours and nights away from their jobs and families. So we need to respect their time as well, and they need to be part of that process. Questions, comments, anything? Seeing none, I think we'll call an end to this. We'll ask for some follow-up items. Mr. Tetro will convene. If anybody has any questions, please email me to them, and I will work on getting answers to them. Does any member of the public have anything they'd like to say? You've been sitting quietly for the night. Seeing none, I'd like to thank you for attending. Do I have a motion? Mr. Stone, second by Mr. Brockfeld. All in favor of adjourning? Those opposed? Abstentions? Thank you. We're done, everybody.